Okay, so welcome everyone. We are so excited to continue our innovation webinar series. So we'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Frankel Cardiovascular Center and Fast Forward Medical Innovation. And as for some housekeeping today, everyone is muted upon arrival. Please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A and they will be answered at the end of our speakers' talks. We also have two upcoming webinars. We have one scheduled for next Wednesday. I will put a link in the chat as well. Next Wednesday, we'll be speaking with some members of our Michigan Medicine Value Assessment team, as well as Nicole Black from MedTech Innovator. And then we also have a webinar coming up on December 7th, which will be a Q&A with Broadview Ventures. David Prim will join us from Broadview, and Sarah Jameson Valencia will moderate the session. She will be joining us from Innovation Partnerships. And with that, I will introduce Jeanne first. Jeanne is joining us from MICHR and the MIAP program today. She is a registered nurse with a bachelor's in both nursing and medical technology. She has over 20 years of research experience with drugs and devices, including phase 1 clinical research trials at Pfizer. And she has worked at MICHR for 15 years and has been the program director since 2018. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeanne to give us a little bit of an overview of the MIAP program and some services that are available to you at U of M.
Great, thank you. Share my screen here. And are you seeing my screen, Ashley?
Yes, okay, I can see it. Perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Slide. So the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, IND IDE Investigator Assistance Program, or MIAP, is here to assist U of M faculty involved with research with drugs, devices, or biologics. MIAP provides expertise and guidance on navigating investigational agent regulation and compliance and assistance with all FDA interactions and communication. The regulatory landscape around medical devices is always changing and can be challenging for investigators, and MIAP is here to remove that barrier as you translate your technology from the bench to the bedside, which will include obtaining IRB approval and any FDA required approvals as well. MIAP offers free consultation services for U of M faculty regarding investigational drugs or devices. We will review your product information and propose clinical protocol to determine if you will require an IND or an IDE from the FDA. We're here to help you to understand and then navigate the FDA regulations. We'll help you determine your regulatory strategy and pathway and guide you through your product development and preclinical testing, including information about manufacturing, device validation and verification, and safety testing to make certain you meet all of the FDA regulations and standards to enable IRB and FDA approval. We'll also review the information presented in your IRB e-research application regarding the drugs and devices that are being utilized. Once you've completed all of your preclinical testing and we've determined that you'll need to submit an application or another submission to the FDA, MIAP will assist with these submissions, including IND exemption request submissions, device risk determination requests, or a full IND or IDE application. If we determine you should meet with the FDA earlier in your product development to seek their guidance via submission of a pre-IND or a pre-submission meeting, MIAP will assist to prepare these submissions as well. Once you have an approved IND or IDE, MIAP will also assist with IND/IDE maintenance submissions. That includes FDA submission of protocol and investigator amendments, information amendments, safety reports, and annual reports. MIAP support and services are mandatory for all U of M faculty who hold an IND or an IDE with the FDA, and we're here to help you to comply with all of those regulatory requirements of being a sponsor investigator. So what is an investigational drug or device? Sometimes it's not clear if your protocol involves an FDA-regulated product. An investigational drug or device can be either an unapproved product that's still being developed or an approved or cleared drug or device being used off-label, so not in accordance with the approved or cleared intended use. This could be a new dose, new technique or method, or using it for a longer duration, a new route of administration, anatomical site or body part, or a different study population. You need to look at the intended use in the protocol. The intended use is also important, and note that just because a product is used off-label routinely here at U of M as part of standard clinical care, it's still considered off-label once it is studied in a clinical protocol, and the IND and IDE regulations could apply. So in addition to standard prescribed or over-the-counter medications, what could be considered an investigational drug? Well, that could be live organisms, cosmetics, botanicals, synthetic compounds, endogenous compounds, or food. Any of those products can be considered a drug if it meets the FDA definition, which is to diagnose, treat, cure, or mitigate disease or affect the structure or function of the body. So what can be considered a medical device? These can include diagnostic products such as laboratory tests, biomarker or genetic sequencing tests, software, mobile medical apps, decision support tools, artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms. If the device is the object of the study being tested for safety or efficacy, and the intended use is to diagnose, treat, cure, or mitigate disease or affect the structure or function of the body, this would be an investigational device, and it could require an IDE from the FDA. So what if you're not certain? Well, then please contact my team. We have a group email that's on this slide, and you can include your protocol, your grant application, or a synopsis, whatever you have, just include it and help us to understand what you're doing. And then we'll assist to determine if there is an FDA regulated medical drug or device, and if it's significant risk, non-significant risk, or if an IND or IDE exempt. We may be able to respond via email, or we may want to schedule a meeting with you to understand and discuss your regulatory strategy. When is it too early to meet with us? We are always here to assist along the entire product development timeline and help you determine the best regulatory strategy. Understanding how your product will be regulated by the FDA is crucial to your development plan. You'll also want to meet with the MIAP team during grant application writing and planning in order to make certain you have included a comprehensive regulatory strategy and support information and budget. We can also provide a letter of support. And once you're ready to move forward with your human clinical trial, MIAP can provide protocol template and a full review and comments from a regulatory perspective. We'll focus on the drug and device information, clinical endpoints, inclusion/exclusion criteria, and safety monitoring. You do not want to hear from the IRB that you require a submission to the FDA. That's kind of too late, and that will cause significant delays for your study. So it's better to understand your FDA requirements and regulatory strategy early. While consultations are free, MIAP does have a fee for service for preparation and submission of an IND and IDE application and other FDA submission work. So we can also discuss any applicable budget considerations when you meet with us. And then this is just another slide with our contact information. And I think we're going to do questions at the end. So I will go ahead and stop sharing now.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. And if anyone has any questions, we can take them now, or we kind of wait till the end if Victor is able to pull up his presentation now.
Yeah, I should be good to go now.
Okay, perfect. Well, then we will move forward with Victor's presentation, and then we can take questions after. As some background information on Victor, he is joining us from the FDA. He earned both his bachelor's and master's in biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan. So go blue. He joined the FDA in 2019 as a TPLC reviewer in the Occluders and Hemostasis Devices team. His work focuses on PFO occluders, interatrial shunts, vascular closure devices, and left atrial appendage occluders. Before joining the FDA, he interned at Pall Corporation, running extractable reports for single-use drug filters. He also has experience at multiple orthopedic and biological assay startups. And with that, I will turn it over to Victor to give us a talk on a brief history of the FDA and how we define medical devices, and talk about his work on the Occluders and Hemostasis Devices team.
All right, can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and it was great to hear your presentation, Jeanne, before this. So yes, I'm a lead reviewer in CDRH, or the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. There's a lot of abbreviations like CDRH. The government loves their abbreviations, so you're probably going to hear a lot of those I'll try to define them all, but if there's any at the end that I kind of just breezed over, feel free to ask me what they mean. So yeah, it's great to be invited to the Frankel Innovation Webinar Series. I'm very always excited to be back at University of Michigan events since I went there. But yeah, so I'm happy to present, and I'm kind of just gonna give a kind of a brief overview of FDA in general, just to kind of see how we got to where we are, and then I kind of wanted to focus in on some of the PMA devices that I review, as well as some things to consider when thinking about trial design for FDA. Um, so yeah, like I mentioned, it's always great to do these presentations because I think there's kind of a disconnect between FDA and some of the physicians and players in the field here. This study here kind of shows that this was a UCSF study that showed that just kind of asked the physicians in the field how well they thought that they understood FDA regulations. And the numbers are not very good, and they're actually worse for medical devices versus drugs, which is drug or devices are what I work on. So we're always trying to help, dispel misconceptions in the field. And one of the biggest ones that we see that's highlighted here is that um, people kind of have the idea that FDA approved devices and products are more effective or more safe than what's currently available. And that's not necessarily always the case. And that kind of has to do with some of the regulatory authority that we're granted. And I'll get into that later. So here's just kind of a brief history of some, things that have kind of happened in the past that precipitated FDA gaining more regulatory authority. Congress is unfortunately reactive instead of being proactive. So a lot of these, big authorities that were granted to the FDA came because of unfortunate health incidents. So the first one here, the Poison Squad, this was actually a group of men that just started lacing. They just kind of got together and had dinner and started lacing their food with some of the additives that were on the market. And they watched themselves for adverse events and things and symptoms and kind of just wrote everything down. And that kind of led directly to the first Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 that kind of started the modern FDA. There's also elixir sulfanilamide in the 30s. That was a cough medicine that was improperly prepared with diethylene glycol, and that led to a lot of poisonings, mostly in children that were taking this. And public outcry led to even more, FDA authorities. The most famous one might be thalidomide. That was a very well-known drug and very commonly taken in women that led to many children being born with birth defects. And that is actually an example of, the FDA being able to respond to some concerns and was able to take the drug off the market. An actual device example here, the Dalkin Shield, was in the 70s, was an IUD that led to septic shock and death in many women. And that was kind of one of the precipitating events for kind of separating devices from drugs and giving the FDA authority to regulate medical devices under the Medical Device Amendments of 1976. One other example here, Therac 25 was a computer-controlled radiation therapy machine, and due to some incorrect programming errors, there were some patients that got massive overdoses of radiation. So overall, FDA isn't always perfect, but we've been working, the best that we can with the tools that we have to try and keep patients safe. We're always, trying to update our authorities and do the best we can with what Congress sets out. This list here is kind of just more as a reference slide, but there's a couple of things I wanted to point out of all the acts that have come out over the years. You see the Medical Device Amendments of 1976 that really separated devices from drugs. And then the big one that we deal with is MDUFA, the Medical Device User Fee Act. That started out in the early 2000s, and that is updated every 5 years. And it's kind of the time where FDA and industry get together and negotiate the rates that companies will be paying for their submissions, and then the timelines that we have to work with. And so there's a lot of negotiations that goes on during those every 5 years to update those. Another thing to note, the FDA is part of HHS, the Health and Human Services. They're not a standalone agency, and we work closely with NIH, CDC, CMS, all the other sister agencies within HHS to kind of protect the public health. So this is a breakdown of the cardiovascular office within FDA. And I'm on the cardiac occluders and hemostasis devices team. There's like 150 people in cardio, and each team has 12 to 15 people. Um, we work really closely with the heart valve devices team as well. We kind of used to be one team. It was just structural heart devices, and that included all of heart valves, occluders, and everything. But recently there was a split between those two teams because of how many devices we were getting, and we needed more resources. But we work closely together. We share resources between those two teams, medical officers, lead reviewers. We all work and help each other out there. So these are the kind of just a breakdown of the devices that I specifically work on. These are mostly structural heart devices and some peripheral devices, but mostly you can see here the two kind of double disked looking things are occluders. You have the PFO occluder and the ASD or PFO occluder. There's also the left atrial appendage occluder on the bottom right. All of these are, designed to plug holes in the heart. And then on the top left there, you have a vascular closure device. These are devices that are after a procedure has catheterization procedure has been done. These are used to kind of plug up the hole that's found in the arteries and veins in the leg that are used for these procedures. And these can be clip-based. They can be suture-based, all different kinds of ways to close the device. But all of these devices are the highest risk class 3 devices, and they all require a PMA. We have some 510K devices on our team, like cardiac catheters, but those are a little bit more rare. And so I'll get into the differences between class 2 and 3 devices later on, but just kind of set the stage there. The team itself is made up of mostly engineers. I'm an engineer. We also have physicians. Most of the time, these are physicians that have been in the field for a long time. They've gained a lot of experience, and we really rely on their expertise to kind of help us understand what's going on in the field and how to design these clinical trials. We have nurses reviewing MDR reports, veterinarians with the animal studies, scientists. We have epidemiologists, statisticians. There's a lot of people on the team, and we work, like I said, with all the other teams as well. So yeah, the main thing we do is obviously review new devices that come in for safety and effectiveness. But even once the devices are approved, we also kind of do some risk analysis, adverse event tracking, and if necessary, we'll initiate compliance actions like recalls. So I've been mentioning device a lot, and I kind of just want to get on the page what the definition of a device is. It's very important because it really decides what we regulate and what the other parts of FDA, like the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, will regulate. So for us, a device is basically anything that is used to treat or prevent or diagnose disease or illness. And the key here is that it's not achieving its intended purpose through chemical action or being metabolized. That's where you kind of differentiate between a drug and a device. Yeah. And so the devices are classified into three categories, class 1, 2, and 3, based on their, level of risk. And class 3 is the highest risk, class 1 is the lowest risk. They're also separated into these device panels. There's circulatory support panel, structural heart devices. These are just to kind of organize them within the subspecialty so that you can kind of focus in on different medical officers and areas of expertise. One thing to note, any new device, so a device that has never been on the market before, and maybe has a new design or new mechanism of action, that's going to automatically be classified as class 3 until it can be classified through certain submission processes that can bring it down to class 1 or 2. So just to kind of give an example of some of the devices that we've seen, at least when I started at the FDA, I was very surprised at how big of a range there are in and what is considered a medical device, and what is not. So, you have your lower risk class 1, something like a toothbrush or, a pair of nitrile gloves that we work with every day. These are very low risk. They don't really require submission, but they can have some things that we need to look at, like sterility. And then on the other end, you have the class 3 devices that they're really high risk. On the left here is an artificial heart valve, and then that left atrial appendage occluder. These are, implanted into the body, being implanted for long term or for life. And so those are very high risk, require a lot of review. And then you kind of have in the middle is everything else. And so the class 2 devices are very broad ranging. You have something that seems simple, like a blood pressure cuff, versus something that can be very complex, like the robotic surgery Da Vinci machine. So it makes it difficult sometimes to, have one type of submission that covers all of these devices, but we do our best there. A couple other surprising ones, contact lens solution is actually a class 2 medical device, as well as medical maggots that's pictured there. So what is the authorization pathway when you have, a device and you're kind of wondering how is this going to fit into the FDA process? The first thing you need to do is decide if it is a device, does it meet the definition? And then if it's a class 1 device, then, there's really not a submission necessary. The general controls kind of apply there and can take over. If it's class 2, you're going to have to submit a 510(k) if you can find a predicate, or a de novo if there's no predicate. And then if it's class 3, you're going to need a PMA, which is a pre-market approval or a pre-market application. And then there's also HDE, humanitarian device exemption. This is similar to like an orphan drug, where if there's 8,000 patients or less that are going to get this treatment or disease, then we kind of have different rules for that type of submission to kind of help make sure we get those devices on the market. And then, of course, like I said, the work doesn't end there. Once a device is approved or cleared, you have to make sure you have your quality systems, inspections. There's medical device reporting, or MDR. That's actually a big part of the FDA, and basically anytime there's a device malfunction or a patient is injured by a device in the field, the patients themselves can report to the FDA, the doctors can report to the FDA, the nurses can report to the FDA, and we get all of those. We have thousands and thousands of those MDRs, and we're constantly trying to review those. We have a whole team dedicated to reviewing those, and they are looking for trends or correlations between maybe some malfunctions and whether we need to make changes to the device or initiate recalls or corrections. So that's a big part of the FDA as well. One thing about language here, 510(k)s are cleared where PMAs are approved. That's just one thing that is set. So what do we actually review? Like I said, the pre-market authorizations of medical devices is probably our biggest job, but we also look at adulteration, misbranding of medical devices. We're always reviewing advertisements to make sure everything is being appropriately advertised. The biggest thing that we kind of see that can happen is somebody promoting their device off-label. This happens a lot, and it really conflicts with something we don't regulate, which is practice of medicine. So, we trust that doctors are going to do what's in the best interest of their patients, and sometimes that means taking a device that's approved in one patient population or one used in one specific way and using it in a different way that they think is better for the patient. That's totally fine. I think the problem comes in if the company knows that this is happening and then they start, advertising their device, that this device works in this way, but it hasn't been tested and we haven't approved it in the labeling. That becomes a real problem. So we can take action there. So what do we actually see in the submissions? The devices that I work on don't have any of the electrical, electromagnetic, wireless things, but we work a lot with biocompatibility testing, chemical characterization on these implants, sterility, obviously, and pension performance testing is really important. I think the two biggest things are animal testing and clinical testing. We see a lot of animal testing with these implant devices. It's very important to kind of give us an idea of how the device will work, whether it can be deployed successfully and safely. And that's really important before going into humans. But obviously, we also need to see the clinical testing. And that can come in many different ways that I'll get into later on. So first, I wanted to kind of go through the two pathways that I've been talking a lot about, the 510(k) and the PMA. So for class 2 devices, this pathway is pretty simple. I mean, compared to the PMA pathway, you'll maybe have some pre-submission meetings to answer some questions, and then you'll do your preclinical bench and sometimes animal testing. There's very rarely clinical testing with 510(k) devices, but I have seen some. And then you'll submit your 510(k). There's a 90-day review clock on that, and that's a very strict timeline. We can put the submission on hold once if we have questions that we need, more clarity, maybe more testing needs to be done. And then the device becomes cleared. And then at that point, it can be marketed. The basis for clearance here is that the device needs to be substantially equivalent to a predicate device, so something that's already cleared and been on the market. And this can lead to, one device being cleared and then it becomes a predicate for another device, it becomes a predicate for another device, and that chain can kind of go on. So yeah, that's the more simple pathway. And I don't work too much on these devices, but I have done a couple. But the main, focus that I work on is the class 3 devices. These are the higher risk devices, and they have a much more lengthy pathway and require a lot more testing. So it starts off the same, you design your device. We really encourage pre-submission meetings. These are very helpful, I think, for both the FDA and for the company to kind of, understand where you're at and any questions you have or questions that we might have about the device to get addressed without the pressure of an actual submission, a marketing submission to review. So once you have your questions, you do your preclinical animal testing. And then in this case, you will, need to come in for a clinical study. We have early feasibility studies or pivotal studies. These are called IDEs, Investigational Device Exemptions. And then I'll get into those details later on. But then once the clinical testing is done, you'll submit your PMA. This has a much longer timeline, 180 days, because there's much more information to review. And while that review is going on in our office, there's also the clinical and manufacturing site inspections going on, as well as there might be an advisory panel meeting. The panel meeting is not for every PMA, but especially if it's a brand new device, you're most likely going to have a panel meeting. And that is basically just an independent board that the FDA consults with. There's experts in the field, and they will take a look at all the data separately from our review. FDA will present, the company will present, and then they will give us a recommendation on whether they think the device is safe and effective. And so we take all that into consideration in our decision, and we will, make an approval or not. The basis for approval here is different from the 510(k). The basis is a reasonable assurance for safety and effectiveness. So these PMA devices have to stand on their own. There's no, predicate to compare them to. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it's different. And then again, their work doesn't end once it's approved. These devices will most likely need a post-approval study to kind of follow up on the patients that have already been enrolled in the pivotal to get those long-term endpoints and make sure everything still looks good. It's also a time to kind of work at expanding, the patient population, making sure that you have good diversity in your clinical trial. And then, of course, there's post-market surveillance. We're going to be, looking for, like I said, reading through those MDRs, making sure there's not any trends. And then if the company makes changes to their devices, which is good, and usually they make them to improve the device, we have to review those as supplements. Those have different timelines as well. They could be 30-day notices or 180-day supplements. And then every year you need to submit an annual report, and we review that. And that's just kind of looking at what is the device? Is there any research that has been done, any studies that have been published outside of the FDA? And we review all of that. So now I want to wanted to get into some of the considerations for clinical trials. There's a few types of clinical trials that the FDA works with. So there's two types, basically, feasibility and the pivotal. The feasibility study is intended to capture preliminary safety and effectiveness data in a small number of subjects without exposing, big groups of patients to this device before we understand its risks. It usually starts with an early feasibility study. These can be 5 to 10, maybe 15 patients at the most. And these really informs the device design. So at this point, the companies can be iterating still. You can still be making changes to your device while the EFS is going. And it's really helpful to kind of get feedback from users in the field and patient data, and early patient data that you get to kind of inform your device design. Once you get through that, you go to the traditional feasibility. This is more kind of to inform the design of the pivotal study more than the design of the device. At this point, you kind of set the design lock on the device, and you really want to focus on designing the big pivotal study and kind of tinkering with your endpoints and making sure that you're in agreement on that. And this can be 15 to maybe 45 patients. And then the pivotal study, this is the big one. This is, designed to collect definitive evidence on safety and effectiveness for specific intended use, typically in a statistically justified number of subjects. And this is the final study that we will really base the approval of the PMA on. So as the pivotal trial is really, the big deal, I kind of wanted to go into some design considerations that FDA thinks are important for the pivotal trial design. One thing to note, the FDA, works really closely with sponsors, and sponsors is just anyone who is sponsoring a medical device submission. Usually it's a large company. It could be a small startup company. It could be, a physician on their own. We've seen really good work with physician-led IDEs. Yeah, that's just what we mean when we say sponsor. So we work closely with the sponsors when designing these trials, but the final say does go with the sponsor on how they want to design their trial. We're not going to approve any IDE where there's patient safety concerns, obviously, but we can only really provide recommendations on the study design, and the company gets to kind of run that how they want. So um, you know, ideally, we would prefer that these trials are randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blinded trials, similar to how you would expect in the drug field. You might think it's difficult to get a medical device study in the structural heart space to be placebo-controlled and blinded, and you'd be right. But it's not like a drug where you can just take a capsule and not know what's in it, and have one group take that and one group take the placebo. When you have an interventional cardiologist that's taking you into the cath lab, inserting a device into your heart, you're going to know, the physician will know whether you got the device or not. So we've kind of to work around this through an interesting procedure called a sham control. So in this case, you have two groups of patients. They both go into the cath lab, but half of them get the procedure, the new device, and the other half just get some measurements taken. So they both feel like they're getting the catheterization done, but each group doesn't know which one got the device. The interventionist will know, which group got the device, but the follow-up cardiologist won't know, and then that doctor can remain blinded. So that's been an interesting way, and that's worked really well, especially in the interatrial shunt space to treat heart failure. So what endpoints do we look at when designing these trials? There's really the two main ones are effectiveness and safety endpoints. The effectiveness endpoint is basically tells us how well the device is working. This can be something like lower rate of mortality, lower rate of stroke. Even, we consider patient-reported outcomes to see whether the patients are actually feeling better themselves. This can be, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Kansas City cardiology questionnaire, KCCQ, 6-minute walk time. These are all things that we consider as effectiveness endpoints. And for safety endpoints, this is basically to determine whether the device or procedure itself or any long-term effects are causing harm to the patients. So you look at something like major cardiovascular and neurological events, MACNE, and those types of things. And these endpoints can be single events, like maybe just stroke rate, or they can be a composite of multiple events. And these endpoints can be compared, directly to a sham control group, like I mentioned. They can be compared to another device group, so you can have device-to-device trials. These can also be compared to just medical management, guideline-directed medical therapy. Even in some cases, you could have a single arm study and you could compare to a performance goal that you might derive from literature. So there's a lot of ways to design these trials. And FDA is always there to help answer questions. One big part of these trials is statistical analysis. I'm not a statistician, so I'm not going to go into all the details here, but usually just kind of the basic points, we expect these endpoints to be powered. That the sample size can range. I've seen maybe 400, 500 patient trials, all the way up to the big, 2,000 patient trials. And that really depends on a lot of things, you know, the risk of the device, but it really depends on the expected event rates. So if you have really high event rates, then you can use a smaller sample size to actually see a difference in the treatment effects. If you have really low event rates, then you might need a larger sample size to kind of see those events actually happening. One example of that, I've worked on some PFO closure device trials, and you know the PFO closure devices work really well. So if you know there's a very low stroke rate in patients that actually get these devices. So if you're a new device coming onto the market and you're trying to compare your device to the current devices, you know you're expecting low stroke rates, and so you kind of need a higher patient population to actually see if you have one or two strokes and the other group has two or three strokes, is there really a difference there? There's a lot of different models that we use. You know, we use Bayesian statistics. The win ratio has been a popular one recently. But, you know, we have a whole office of statisticians separate actually from my team, and they're really smart and they know all of the statistical tips and tricks, and they're really helpful when just helping me understand these trials and as well as the companies that are coming in, and we work closely with them. Um, so obviously, you know, these IDE data that I've been mentioning is the ideal when supporting a PMA. You know, it's prospective, it's representative of the US population, and FDA has had a hand in helping, you know, design this. So we're familiar with this trial. But it's not the only type of data that we see, and we've seen PMA supported with other types of data as well. Obviously, there's outside of the U.S. clinical trials that are run. We call that OUS. Um, you know, when we look at this data, we consider whether these sites have similar medical practice to the U.S., their standards, how many patients were enrolled, how long were they enrolled, what is the diversity of the patient population, all of that stuff. And we can use that data. You know, usually we'll see OUS data as kind of a way to maybe skip EFS or feasibility and go straight to pivotal. It's kind of difficult to support a full PMA with just OUS data, just because the differences, you know, we really want to see these devices in a trial in the US before we approve them in the US. But I think it has been done before, so it's possible. And then finally, we have seen kind of an increase in interest in real world data and real world evidence. So real world data is data derived from things like electronic health records, medical claims data, or data from registries. There's a lot of cardiovascular registries that are starting to be built up, and this data is really good. It's helpful. It's can be you can get very large numbers of patients. It can be very detailed, but it is different. It's not prospectively, you know, collected. It's kind of collected retrospectively, kind of looking back, and um, you don't have as much control over the endpoints and the way the trial is designed with this type of data. Um, but you know, we've seen PMA supported with this type of data, so it is possible. One thing to note, there's a kind of a difference between real world data and evidence. The way that FDA considers it, real world evidence is actually the evidence of benefit risk derived from the real world data, and that's what informs our regulatory decisions. Um, so just to point out a couple of the other actors in the field, you know, FDA is obviously important for, you know, these clinical trials, but there's multiple other groups that are also working on these trials. You know, IRBs, institutional review boards, these are there to ensure the protection of the rights and welfares of the human patients. FDA, you know, always requires IRB approval. Always requires FDA approval. So, you know, we work together and are trying our best to protect these patients. Another big one that we work with is the Data Safety Monitoring Board on these big trials, DSMB. This is an independent group of experts that monitor the clinical trials to ensure the safety of the participants and the quality of the data. This group is really important. They are always monitoring the trials, and they kind of can help decide whether, you know, oh, there's a signal here, we need to halt the trial, or everything looks good, we can continue going. And I've reviewed meeting minutes from those DSMB meetings, and that really helps inform FDA as well of what's going on in the trial. And then finally, the Echo Core Lab is kind of a support group that helps clinical trials by offering expertise and consistency in imaging acquisition and measurements. You know, with these structural heart devices, there's a lot of data that comes out and a lot of imaging that is done, and these labs really kind of help keep it consistent. And so all these monitoring entities are important in ensuring that the patients remain safe and that the data is accurate and as consistent as possible. So that's pretty much all I had. I definitely wanted to plug pre-submissions. I think Jeanne mentioned these as well, but they're really helpful. These can be just purely informational meetings or include specific questions for FDA. I don't think there's too early of a time to have come in with a pre-submission. I would suggest doing it at as soon as you're ready. And this can really help, nail down what we would expect in a clinical study. So that you're not trying to submit an IDE that's not ready, and then we have to decline it. And then another thing to note, the CDRH portal is now becoming online. You used to have to always mail everything in, and now we've started to join the 21st century. So if you have any questions on how to submit things or when to submit things, what to include, I'm always available. Feel free to email me. If I don't know the answer, I'll try and find someone who does. But yeah, that's all I had. So thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Victor. It looks like we do have one question in the Q&A for Jeanne, and the question is, are MIAP services available for faculty, or can they also be utilized by postdocs and research investigators?
Great, thanks for the question. Yes, postdocs and research investigators, if we've had nurses before who are going to be conducting a trial involving drugs, devices. So yes, they are all welcome to come meet with us. We would encourage you to come. So feel free to reach out.
And Dr. Kambari, it looks like you have a question as well.
Thank you so much, Victor and Jeanne. That was terrific. I have a few questions for Victor, and I wanted to kind of maybe dive a little bit deeper on some of the issues that you touched on. You did briefly mention quality system regulations and the visits that you do to manufacturing facilities. Can you talk a little bit about the process and what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So when there's a PMA submission, the companies submit this huge, usually they're module-based PMAs. So you'll submit, your first module is your, bench testing, chemistry testing, biocompatibility. Second module is usually your manufacturing quality systems. Third module is your clinical data. So that second module is where we really focus in on, making sure you're following the quality system regulations, making sure you have lists in place to make sure that you're not missing anything. And then at that point we will do an inspection, and that's kind of separate from my team, but we work with the inspections teams, and they'll actually go out in person to the manufacturing site. They have, maybe it's like a 2 or 3 days they'll spend there, and they'll review all of your documents, your data management systems, everything that you have going on to manufacture this device, and making sure that everything is consistent. And then once they finish the review, they actually send us their report, and then we kind of take a second look at it, make sure everything is appropriate. And then if we think it's fine, then that moves on. If there needs to be more work done, then that can actually be a reason to halt the PMA. Even if all your data is good, the quality system manufacturing also needs to be good.
Oh, that's terrific. I have another question about your post-market surveillance. Can you talk a little bit about the design of studies post-approval, and how do you actually keep up with it, and how often there's reporting mandate from the company to report to the FDA?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's definitely something that we've kind of struggled with in the past. Once the company receives approval, they just have much less incentive to, work really hard on the post-approval study. And I think, there's some tension there. I think in general, we would expect the post-approval study to pretty much just follow what was done in the initial study. It's difficult though if you have, like I was saying, like a randomized controlled study, and you won't want to allow any patient that was in the control group wants to, switch over to the device group. So it's difficult to, there's not longer going to be a control group. It's just going to be a single arm study. You're just going to be having these patients with just the device and just following them, and hopefully you're going to follow up with them, and every 12 months, 6 months, 12 months. It's different for each study, but it really just, you hope that you can keep touching them. You lose a lot of them to follow up, because they're not in a trial anymore. And it is challenging. So we really want to focus on getting as much good data as we can in the pivotal study, because we know once it goes to post-approval study, it can be challenging.
Yeah, is the real world evidence that you talked about, is that something that needs to be discussed during the pre-submission or PMA, pre-PMA meeting, or that's something that can be brought forth after the PMA submitted?
Yeah, it depends. If you want to use real-world evidence to support your PMA, then we would want to talk about that, beforehand. So you might come with a pre-submission and be like, we have these 3 registries that have been following patients for so long, we think we can get good data from it. Give us as much information as you can, and then you can ask the question, like, do you think this registry is enough to support the approval in this patient population for this device that we've seen? And so, yeah, that's something we'd want to talk about. Usually with real world evidence, it's kind of supporting maybe a change in indication, or a change in maybe a modification to the device. Usually this is a device that's already been on the market, but maybe is being used off label, like I was mentioning. And so the company will be like, we have this registry, this device is being used this way. It's not approved this way, but can we get it approved this way because we have enough data from this registry showing that it's actually safe and works. So usually that's where I've seen the real world evidence. And yeah, I've worked with companies on pre-submissions to, whittle down, like, how does this data work, and then ask a bunch of questions on it. And then they would submit the PMA afterwards with the real world evidence to support the PMA.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, it looks like there's another question. This could be posed to both of you, but maybe more directed towards Jeanne. Are there specific trainings for research coordinators who coordinate device studies? I don't know if either of you have any insight into that. If not, I'm happy to connect the person who asked the question. I'm happy to connect with you after the call.
So yes, MICHR, the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, we do have trainings available. They come out in our newsletters to help study coordinators who are specifically working in the FDA regulated space. MIAP does have an online training. It's specifically aimed for sponsor investigators talking about their responsibilities of holding an IND or an IDE with the FDA, but it's also very helpful for coordinators, and coordinators could take that training as well. So I'll be happy to provide that information to you, Ashley, and you can distribute it after the meeting.
That would be great. Thank you. And the next question we have, if a device is approved for use in adults, what is the pathway for extending approval to children?
Yeah, I can try to address this one. So yeah, adult populations and children populations are very different. Most of the devices that I work on are for the older patient populations. So it is not really necessary to use them in children because you don't have heart failure, or you don't have, these stroke rates in younger patients. But there are devices that are designed for pediatrics. Obviously, there's a lot of congenital heart disease out there, and it's basically a whole different world, and it's much more challenging to find funding for these patients because, with the devices that I work on, all the patients are on Medicare. So you have, the coverage, and there's not as much coverage for younger people. So I think it can be challenging. I don't know exactly having a device approved for adults and then extending it down to children. That would probably require, another IDE, I would expect, that looks specifically at children, or maybe real world evidence if it's already being used in children off label. I don't know in a specific pathway for that.
Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question. Is there training for students and or faculty that are developing devices on best practices or how to build device history files for their devices that they may be developing?
So John, I don't know, FFMI, I know we're developing a medical device training course that hopefully would assist with this, but do you know of trainings out there right now for faculty that are developing devices? I don't know if John I took him off guard, probably.
Yeah, sorry. So that medical device course should be up in the next 6 or 8 months, but at the moment, unfortunately, nothing does come to mind.
But we are happy to meet if you are developing a device and you want to talk about the need and when to have design controls and working along the device development pathway. That is something that MIAP talks with. We can talk to you about, we can meet with you about that. We can point you to FDA guidance and speak with you about FDA regulations and compliance with their standards. So also set up a meeting with MIAP and we're happy to talk about that with you.
Yeah, and Jeannie just mentioned guidances. I think that's something I didn't mention in my presentation, but if you are, trying to work through something and you really just don't know where to go, I would always suggest just looking at the FDA guidances that we put out before reaching out to someone else, because I think those documents are really well done and they are generic enough to apply to a lot of things, but also specific enough to give you examples of what's going on. So I think I would always recommend to look at those as a first pass before you reach out to other people.
Victor, where are you guys on accepting digital twin studies for regulatory approvals? The cost issue came up, the questions with children came up. This seems like a reasonable approach. Have you guys, I know you guys are working on developing some guidelines around it, but have you had any experience with it at all at the FDA?
Yeah, I personally haven't. I've heard, like you said, it's coming around, but I can't really speak to how we would consider that data, but personally, but that's something I'll probably look into, and I could get back to you on that if you'd like.
That would be great.
Well, thank you so much. We're coming up on our time.
There's one more question.
Oh, you do? Okay. Wow, I'm so glad we're getting so many good questions. This is great. Let's see. Are pre-subs with the FDA only for companies commercializing drugs or devices, or is this something that students and faculty should consider?
I'm happy to talk to that. We support submitting pre-submission meetings all the time on behalf of U of M faculty. Anytime that you are thinking about conducting your safety studies to enable a human clinical trial, we encourage meeting with the FDA prior to conducting those studies because those can be quite expensive, and we want to make sure that we're conducting them in a way that would enable the FDA to consider your product safe and effective. So we assist with pre-submission meetings on behalf of our faculty and staff all the time. And if you meet with us, we'll be happy to talk to you about if it makes sense to meet with the FDA and set up one of those meetings and how we can assist. And I think Victor talked about the importance of pre-sub. So Victor, I'll let you talk about that too.
No, I definitely echo that. I think you can, so there's really two types of pre-subs. There's one's called an informational meeting, and then you have the pre-submission meeting is kind of the other one. So with the informational meeting, you can kind of just say like, hey, we have this device, we think it's going to work this way. It's kind of a show and tell, just like to put it on our radar, and we can answer any preliminary questions you have. We always encourage those as early as possible. And then there's the full meeting where we provide written feedback to any questions that you have, and then we meet and discuss those questions. So I think, if you have more of a, device design down, you're starting to do testing, then yeah, that second option is good for answering direct questions. But the first one, informational meetings, can be done at really any time that you have a device idea in hand.
Okay, well, it looks like there are no more questions. So thank you again, Jeannie and Victor, for joining us. This was really informational, and I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. And I will follow up after this to all attendees with the recording and any other documentation that we talked about today. So thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.